Welcome to the Capital News. I am your host, Alex Crisis. Today is September 17th, 2019. Thank you so much for joining me. It's Constitution Day today, ladies and gentlemen, and I would hope and would truly appreciate if most members of Congress would actually take the time to read the Constitution, because I don't believe that they have read it. And if they have read it, I don't believe they understand it. So they should reread it again and again and again until they do, because the rights that they have taken away from us or are infringing upon our rights is ridiculous, to say the least. And I've said it before here on this podcast that I am going to take the time to go through, once things start to calm down, whenever that might be, or I'm going to have to do an aside podcast and have to do a little bit of a special series, but I'm going to take the time to read the Constitution, and then we're going to dissect it and go through it. So it's important, because most people probably have not read the Constitution ever, or if they have, they haven't read it since they were in grade school. So it's not a large or lengthy document, but it is one with great historic importance, and one that has set the stage for world history for the past 200 and some odd years. And it continues to serve as a remarkable document, despite the shenanigans and the chaos and the fraud and the abuse that we have in this country. And it is not limited to this country, the fraud and the abuse and the nepotism and everything like that. Our Constitution still keeps this country together, because it still has checks and balances. The presidency is not a dictatorship, nor is the judiciary, nor is the Congress. And that checks and balances system that we have adopted has held the test of time, although it is being tested right now on multiple fronts, and it has been for quite a while. So that's Constitution Day. So maybe send a letter to your congressman to read it. Maybe send him a couple questions in there to quiz him. And we're going to talk about letters today, because I told you yesterday on yesterday's podcast that the president, his office, the White House, responded to my letter that I had sent to the president back in May. So we're going to take the time to read some of that response here in a little bit, but we do have some news that we want to cover, primarily centered around the economic news, because the Federal Reserve is coming out with their policy decision tomorrow. So let's get straight to the market news. We'll have a little bit of a discussion on what's taking place there, and then we'll get to the letter. So the S&P gained 8 points for the day. The Dow was up 34. The NASDAQ gained 32 points. And the Russell 2000, the small cap index, gave back 6 points for the day. The Dow Jones Transports lost 0.2%, and the New York Stock Exchange gained 0.2%. Oil, despite the massive shock that we witnessed over the weekend and during yesterday's trading, we have WTI pulling back and is now trading at $58 a barrel. It was at $62 during yesterday's podcast, so now it is at $58, so quite the pullback. Brent, the international metric, is trading at $64.50 a barrel, also quite the pullback, because it was trading at $68 a barrel during yesterday's podcast. Gold is trading at $1,504 an ounce. Silver is at $17.91 an ounce. U.S. 10-year Treasury pulled back a little bit on its yield. Again, a continuation to a flight to safety, is now yielding 1.81%. A lot of this decline over the past couple of days is probably on the back of the quote-unquote oil shock, the rise in geopolitical tensions, perhaps further escalation, and then maybe getting back to understanding that the Federal Reserve is likely to cut interest rates, because we did a podcast last Friday, Is There Trouble in the Bond Market? I suggest you take a look at that one, because we talk about a lot of things in that podcast and have gotten some good feedback on it as well. We have the VIX, the volatility index, losing 1.5% today and is now trading at $14.44. Now, to the Dow Jones Transports, and again, the reason we focus on the Dow Jones Transports is because of the Dow theory. It takes a lot of companies, there's a lot of logistics, right? Moving goods and services from point A to point B. Stands to reason. If there is higher volumes, it must signal that the economy is humming along, it's moving along nicely, because there's a lot of goods and services being moved. Conversely, if there's lower volume, not a lot going on, then perhaps the economy is slowing down, and we look at the Dow Jones Transports as a leading indicator. This tends to hold the test of time. It makes a lot of intuitive sense. And again, it plays out in the numbers and has over a long period of time. And we have said here on numerous occasions that there has been a divergence between the Dow Jones Transports and the broader stock market, primarily with the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, and the NASDAQ. And we said, well, if it's a leading indicator and the Dow Jones Transports has been moving to the downside and the S&P has been moving to the upside, well, something's wrong. If Dow Jones Transports, if the Dow theory holds, it's a leading indicator, then it would reason that the S&P, the Dow, and the NASDAQ are going to come home and meet the Dow theory, to meet the Dow Jones Transports at a lower level. We have yet to see this. And in fact, we've seen quite the run-up over the past week and a half with the Dow Jones Transport sort of catching up to the growth that we've seen in those other larger indexes. So it's something to be mindful of. But today, we had FedEx report their earnings after hours. They missed. They missed on revenue, they missed on profits, and they gave forward guidance to the downside. Not good, ladies and gentlemen. And in fact, in after-hours trading, we have FedEx down 10%. 10% in after-hours trading. That's a huge loss in one day. And this is after hours. So we're going to see what happens tomorrow. But this is a continuation. This is probably going to wreak a lot of havoc on the Dow Jones Transports. So this is not good for the overall market. However, we also have the Federal Reserve concluding their two-day monetary policy meeting tomorrow. We are anticipating that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates by 25 basis points at a minimum. The oil shock appears to be over. We said, look at this thing in perspective. We said all you have to do is look back a few months, and this is where oil was trading. Nobody was panicking. Nobody was riding in the streets over this. Of course, that was simply a bunch of people in the marketplace bidding up the price. Maybe they thought, well, there's going to be a trade deal or something back then. Maybe there's a tweet, a headline, things seem positive. So now the economy is just going to snap itself back into a growth phase because everything's going to be okay on the trade front. Of course, that's a bunch of nonsense, but it's a headline that drove the markets. And you had oil trading at the prices that we saw yesterday. So we said, take a deep breath, understand what's going on here. Donald Trump did not want to escalate, which was a good thing. He deserves our applause and to be commended for that. We do not need another war anywhere. We do not need one in the Middle East. This was oil. This was black stuff that bubbles out of the earth. There was steel and metal and equipment that got mangled because they were bombed over the weekend. No Americans were dead. Okay, no Americans were killed, I should say. All right, so there is no reason to escalate this thing further, although that's what we've been seeing. We have been seeing escalation. Oil tankers, drones, now it's oil fields and oil processing facilities getting bombed. So we'll see what happens next because something else is likely to happen at some point. So we got to keep our minds on that. We got to keep our eyes and ears focused on these geopolitical risks that exist. But for the time being, it appears that this oil shock is over. The world is still awash with a lot of oil. This was 5% that was of the global supply that was affected, and now we have news out of Saudi Arabia that's saying, well, now we anticipate that these facilities will be up and running back to normal within a couple few weeks. So not a couple few months, not a couple few days, but within a couple few weeks. So we'll see what happens there. Again, let's pray for peace and prosperity. No more escalation, no more war. We don't want it. We don't need it. Can't afford it. Okay? So that's that. Now, on the Federal Reserve front, we had, and if you guys were paying attention to some of the financial mainstream news media today, you probably saw some headlines with the Federal Reserve and repo, REPO, short for repurchase agreement, short-term borrowing, okay, when it has to deal with government debt. Now, this is what the Federal Reserve has done, okay? There was a liquidity crunch that took place in overnight lending, all right? Now, I don't think this is a coincidence that there was a liquidity crunch on the same day that we have a massive oil shock. Now, maybe it is a coincidence, but I don't think it is. I think it's somehow related. So, we've stated many times on this podcast that this is something to be on the lookout for, a liquidity crunch, because we have the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates, although they're still at, really historic lows, basically at 2%. I mean, we were at 0% for quite a while. Now we're at 2%. I mean, that's nothing. That's still at very, very low levels. Yet it's causing a whole bunch of problems in the market. That's scary. That's extremely scary. And we talk about the reasons as to why that is all the time here on this podcast. So if you're new to this podcast and you stick with it, you're going to understand why, because that's what we talk about here. But we have the Federal Reserve had to go in and basically do a mini round of quantitative easing. That's what this is akin to, because the Federal Reserve had to go in and buy U.S. Treasury bonds, and they also bought some mortgage-backed securities to the tune of $53 billion. At least that's what's being reported, $53 billion. That's basically akin to what the Federal Reserve was doing on a monthly basis when it came to quantitative easing. They were out there in the markets buying $50 billion a month of U.S. Treasuries of different durations, mortgage-backed securities, and a couple other things. Agency debt, they call it. So this is not good, ladies and gentlemen. Now, one day does not make a trend, but now this signals to me that if the Federal Reserve has to embark on these types of measures to inject the system with liquidity on an overnight basis, that they are most likely going to be cutting interest rates tomorrow, at least by 25 basis points. If they cut them by 50 basis points, they're concerned. They're going to be scared. They're going to try to justify it if they do 50 basis points, but they're going to have a lot of explaining to do if they do so. But 25 basis points, I think they might even start talking about quantitative easing. We're going to have to read between the lines in their communication. They are terrible at communicating. We know this, but this is what's going to happen. I'm anticipating a cut of 25 basis points. There's going to be some forward guidance, probably that's going to indicate that they are going to continue to do whatever it takes to maintain this business expansion in the longest business cycle that we have ever experienced in the United States. Okay? So these are the things we have to pay attention to. But this was basically a stealth version of quantitative easing that happened overnight. It's amazing, isn't it? We've had nothing but liquidity injections for a decade, basically. Extremely low interest rates. We have a short period of time where they start to attempt to quote-unquote normalize interest rates. Don't even get close to normal. Not even close. We got to 2.5%, 2.25%. And then you had the president throw a hissy fit. You have Wall Street throwing a hissy fit. And now you have the markets. Where's the money? Where's the money? We need liquidity. We got a problem. We got a problem. And boy, do we. This is not the solution. I'm telling you guys, this is actually getting quite frightening, because if this continues and there is a big liquidity crisis, a liquidity crunch, this is really what brought down the system back in the Great Recession. Yeah, sure, it was all with the subprime and all the debt, but it was a liquidity problem. People didn't have money. Banks weren't trusting each other on an overnight basis. This is it. This is trust and confidence. So this is something that we got to pay very close attention to. And a lot of the pundits and analysts on the mainstream media were just talking, well, of course they were covering it, which they would, but they were downplaying a lot of it, simply like they were with the yield curve inversion and all that stuff. Oh, it's okay. It's just the one and done. We don't have to worry about it. No, you got to pay attention to this. You have to pay attention to this. And we are going to here. Now, to get to the letter, my beautiful letter from Donnie Boy, the president. Well, for those of you who have been following this podcast for quite a while know that I sent a letter to the president and to the White House back in May of this year, simply because I was fed up with what has been taking place in this country, the divisiveness and a lot of the rhetoric and actions that have been undertaken by the president himself and members of his administration. And really the letter, the heart and soul of the letter had to deal with the credibility of the president himself, and more importantly, the credibility of the office of the President of the United States of America, because we tied a lot of this argument around U.S.-China trade talks, because we've been pulled around for over a year, now almost going on 2 years, that everything's fine, that China wants to make a deal, that we're going to have a signing ceremony, that we're in the final laps, and that everything's going to be rosy and peachy and just fine. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. I also called into question the president and what I believe is an abuse of his executive powers with market manipulation. And I call this out in the letter because any time that the markets were selling off, and you have nothing but evidence on this, ladies and gentlemen, so you might disagree with me, but the facts are going to prove you wrong. Anytime the markets were selling off, you have the president coming out on Twitter or making statements to the media or sending out an economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, Peter Navarro, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, go out there and tell the media that everything's okay, that there's going to be a trade deal between the United States and China. And they did. And lo and behold, the markets rallied. Or they didn't lose as much as they were because a positive statement came out. Conversely, because you can make money when the markets go up and you can make money when the markets go down. So we know that the president knows what he's going to tweet beforehand. Logical question, is he benefiting from this personally? Is he trading the markets? Is he sending a message to his son or daughter? Hey, go out there, get in the stock market, get in the options market, and go make a lot of money because we're going to manipulate these markets. I hope not. I honestly hope not, but maybe he is. Maybe it's a member of his administration, his cabinet. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a friend of a friend. That deserves to be investigated, whether you voted for this guy or not. You cannot have a president abusing his power like this. You can't. And he knows what he's doing because he is obsessed with the stock market and the economy. He is hanging his hat in his re-election campaign and basically his entire legacy on the economy and the stock market, which is ridiculous, but that's what he's doing. And I'm calling him out on it, and that was the letter. I said, you cannot continue to make these statements because it's going to call into question your credibility, which it has. He already has people on the left. He already has his anti-Trumpers, his never-Trumpers out there. They're not going to believe him anyway. But you have people who may have voted for him, who may have crossed the line on the Democrat Party, people who voted for President Obama, who crossed the line to say, okay, let's give Donald Trump a shot because things aren't that great and the system really needs reformed. It really needs change, and let's give this guy a shot. Well, if he continues down this path, he's going to have a very hard time winning re-election if that's what he wants to do. And again, my letter is a lot bigger than his re-election campaign. It's about the office of the presidency and the credibility thereof, because that's a reflection of us. If Donald Trump wants to make himself look like a fool and run the Trump organization in that matter, that's his business. He can do so. He can't do that here with the United States of America. He cannot do that with the office of the presidency because it makes us look like fools as well. And I don't like it at all. So I called him out on it with the letter. It was a constructive criticism, but that was the heart and soul of it, okay? Because a lot of the things that I said in that letter ended up coming true when it came to further policy, especially in regards to U.S.-China trade talks. And now we have a supposed trade agreement between the United States and Japan, although the markets don't seem to care. So, I mean, it's kind of tragic if you think about it. I mean, all of these trade deals, one of them finally gets done, perhaps, at least on a limited basis, between the U.S. and Japan, and the markets couldn't care less. It's the granddaddy of them all is the U.S.-China trade talks, and we're going to continue with that. So if you have not heard or read that letter, you can find that letter on our website at thecapitalnews.com, thecapitalnews.com. If you want to listen to that letter being read aloud, you can find that on thecapitalnews.com as well, or our YouTube channel, The Capital News, because I did take the time to read the letter, because it's a lengthy letter. It's basically the length of a typical podcast, 20, 30 minutes. It's about 5 pages long. It goes after the president in a constructive manner as far as I'm concerned, but I felt obligated to write it. I really did, because I think it's an abuse of power, and the credibility issue, especially when it comes to the office of the presidency, is a reflection of us, and I just simply don't like the tactics and the behavior of this president. So I called him out on it. Now, of course, nothing's going to change, unfortunately, but that's, still, you got to do your part, and I did to some extent. Now, never expecting to hear back from the White House, but we did, and I got my beautiful letter from the White House here. And it states the following. I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but I'm going to pick a few paragraphs to read to you. And it says, Dear Mr. Crisis, oh, how formal, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to express your views regarding foreign policy and our national security. My administration is devoted to protecting the American homeland and the American people, promoting American prosperity, preserving peace through strength, and advancing American influence. My national security strategy describes how my administration will protect and advance these 4 core national interests. It is based on a clear-eyed assessment of our interests and a determination to tackle the challenges we face, and acknowledges that there are military, economic, and political competitions in which we must engage to protect American interests and values. My administration has the confidence to compete. Economic security is national security. A strong economy protects the American people and sustains American power. We will rejuvenate the American economy for the benefit of American workers and companies. We will insist on fair and reciprocal economic relationships to address trade imbalances. We are committed to preserving our leadership in research and technology and to protecting our economy from competitors who unfairly acquire our intellectual property. And we will embrace America's energy dominance because unleashing abundant energy resources stimulates our economy. Another central principle of my national security policy is achieving peace through strength. While I am committed to seeking diplomatic solutions to our critical international challenges, we must grow and modernize our military forces, including space and cyber capabilities, to ensure our military power is second to none. Despite the tremendous gains our military has made against ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq, jihadist terrorist organizations continue to present a dangerous threat to America. Working with partner nations is essential to meeting these challenges, as is ensuring that our allies are contributing their fair share to our mutual defense and to the defeat of foreign terrorist threats. America has been amongst the greatest forces for good in the world. My foreign policy celebrates America's influence in the world as a positive force that can help set the conditions for peace and prosperity. We will continue to champion American values and offer encouragement to those struggling for human dignity in their societies. Sincerely, Donald J. Trump. So again, I appreciate the fact that the White House sent a letter in response. I was not anticipating that being the case. Of course, it took a few months, which is perfectly okay. I'm sure they are completely inundated with letters from individuals, from professional organizations, and the like for a whole multitude of reasons. Of course, this is a standard run-of-the-mill response. Basically, they read the letter, my letter. What bucket does it fall in? They said, well, this must fall in the bucket of foreign policy and national security. And so they assign my name to the top of the letterhead, and then they send it off to me. Now, of course, this does not address my argument. This does not address the credibility of the president himself and the office thereof. This does not specifically call out the tactics in regards to the U.S.-China trade talks. I didn't expect that to happen. They can get a hold of me. Clearly, they know how to find me. So if they want me to help, I will do it. I will serve this country proudly. My loyalty will be to the American people. It won't be to Donald Trump. If he does something or says something that I'm in agreement with, I'll stand by the guy. If he doesn't, I'm going to critique him, just like I do here on this podcast on a daily basis. But my loyalty, if they called me to serve this country, I would do so. But they'd have to change course, because otherwise I'd be just saying things that just aren't going to happen. There's a lot of problems that we're facing. We are now going to be in the midst of the 2020 presidential campaign. And are we being roped-a-doped here by the Chinese? Yeah, come on. We'll continue with these trade talks, because what's it cost them? It costs them nothing. It costs them the plane ride over. A couple hours. Yeah, okay. Maybe the U.S. delegation goes to Beijing. Maybe the Beijing delegation comes to Washington, D.C. And back and forth we go. It doesn't cost them anything. Could be roped-a-doped. Yeah, we can sign a deal. And then boom, right before election time, they drop the ball and say, nah, we don't want it. We don't think it's a good thing. I mean, look, that's what the president has to be aware of. And I think people within his administration are aware of this, because we've seen some signaling recently that we're not in any hurry. That was from his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who I cannot stand, who needs to be fired. But nevertheless, that's my opinion. So again, that was the letter. You can find my letter on the capitalnews.com. And I hope you take the time to read it. It's 5 pages long, or at least take the time to listen to the podcast where I took the time to read it aloud to you guys, because I think it gets to the crux of the matter, and that's really where I'm starting to lose my confidence in faith in the president and his administration, which is not a good thing, because you want the president to succeed, whoever he or she might be, because they are representing the United States of America. We can have our policy differences, and that's fine. That's what this country is about. But you don't want them to fail. But the credibility is a huge thing as far as I'm concerned. The abuse of power, as far as I'm concerned, with the market manipulation and perhaps other areas, is something that I simply cannot tolerate. And I hope people are starting to wake up to that fact, because this is not what we want. This is not what I voted for. This is not setting a good precedent for future presidents, because there will be future presidents of this party, of the Republican Party, of the Democrat Party, and perhaps a third party. And I can assure you, those who might be okay with this because you're a Republican or because you voted for the guy, you're looking the other way. Once the other party gets into power, and it's just a matter of when, you wouldn't like it. You wouldn't like it. So you got to take off your blinders. You got to get out of your corner. You got to get out of your silo, and you got to start thinking independently, because that's the only way we're going to start solving these problems. And of course, the other way to start solving these problems is to end the Federal Reserve and to abolish the federal income tax. And we're going to see why tomorrow, because the markets are in a holding pattern, because everybody, all eyes, like we said during yesterday's podcast, all eyes are on the Federal Reserve. This is not a free market capitalistic system. When you have the global economy, not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy, waiting on pins and needles to hear what one idiot has to say on behalf of 12 idiots, is ridiculous. And there is no way that is anywhere near being free market capitalistic in nature. Not even close. So with that, I will wrap up this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Please leave your comments. We love hearing from you. Stay diversified, stay vigilant, and stay with the Capital News. I am Alex Koritis. Godspeed.